It was a quiet evening in a small southern town when everything changed for one man. A shocking encounter with the police turned his world upside down and left witnesses in disbelief. Imagine being pulled over for a routine stop, only for things to escalate in the most unimaginable way. This story follows a black man, an ordinary guy just trying to get home, who suddenly finds himself in a terrifying situation no one should ever experience. Dragged behind his own car by a rope, how did it come to this? And what happened next will leave you speechless. This isn't just about one man, it's about a moment that sparked outrage, courage, and a community coming together to demand answers. Stay tuned as we dive into the truth behind this shocking event, revealing twists and turns that you won't see coming. It all started when Marcus, a hard-working father of two, was driving home after a long day. He'd been running late, anxious to make it in time for dinner with his kids. But as he turned onto a dimly lit road, flashing blue and red lights suddenly filled his rearview mirror. His heart sank. Like many, Marcus had always felt uneasy during traffic stops, but he stayed calm, pulled over, and waited for instructions. The officer approached, but something felt off. The questions were sharp, the tone tense, and Marcus sensed the situation spiraling quickly. He tried to explain himself, but his words were met with dismissive gestures. Moments later, backup arrived. What should have been a simple stop was turning into something far more intense. Witnesses nearby recall hearing raised voices, but couldn't see what was happening clearly in the dark. Some said they thought they saw movement around Marcus's car. Others claimed they heard him calling out. All anyone knows for sure is that what happened next was deeply unsettling. Suddenly, Marcus was on the ground. A rope appeared, a moment no one could fully process. Was this real? Why was this happening? The crowd began to grow, murmurs of confusion turning into gasps. No one could have prepared for what unfolded next. As the chaos unfolded, Marcus could feel the stares of the growing crowd, but his focus was on survival. He didn't understand why things had escalated so quickly. He kept asking, "What did I do wrong?" But his questions went unanswered. The officers seemed more intent on controlling the situation than providing any clarity. With every passing moment, the tension grew thicker. Among the onlookers was a young woman named Jasmine, who had just stepped out of a nearby diner when she noticed the commotion. Something about the scene didn't sit right with her. She grabbed her phone and began recording, capturing every second of the shocking incident. Jasmine's hands were trembling, but she knew this footage could be crucial. Across the street, an older man named Harold watched from his porch, shaking his head. He'd lived through his fair share of injustice and knew this would end badly if no one intervened. Meanwhile, Marcus's mind raced as he tried to process the surreal events. The rope was tight, and he struggled to catch his breath. He thought about his family, his kids waiting at home, and the promise he made to always protect them. He couldn't give up now, but the situation was spiraling out of his control. The crowd began shouting questions, demanding answers, but the officers remained silent. No one knew what would happen next, but the fear and anger in the air were impossible to ignore. The air was electric, filled with shouts, murmurs, and the hum of car engines as more people gathered. Jasmine kept her phone steady, her heart pounding in her chest. Every second felt heavier than the last. Marcus, still on the ground, felt the cold bite of the rope against his skin. His mind flashed to his children's faces, their laughter, their hugs. He thought of how much he had fought to give them a better life. He couldn't let this be the end of his story, but he had no idea how to change the course of what was happening. The officers barked orders to the crowd, telling them to back away, but their voices were drowned out by the rising noise. Harold, still watching from his porch, stepped forward hesitantly. His years had taught him when to speak and when to act, but this moment felt different. He pulled out his phone, dialing someone he trusted in the community, a person who might be able to make a difference before it was too late. In the distance, the sound of more sirens grew louder. Reinforcements were coming, but no one was sure if they would bring calm or chaos. Jasmine caught the faint look of fear in Marcus's eyes as he glanced at the growing crowd. It was the look of a man who didn't know if he would make it out of this alive. The crowd surged closer, their voices louder now, demanding to know why Marcus was being treated this way. The crowd held its breath as the officer paused, his hand hovering over his belt. The attorney stepped closer, her tone unyielding. "You're being recorded by everyone here. You're accountable for every action you take from this moment on." The tension in the air was almost unbearable, and Marcus could feel his heart racing. He couldn't see everything happening around him, but he could feel the energy shifting again, like the tide turning. Suddenly, another unmarked car pulled up, and an older officer stepped out, his uniform different from the others. He introduced himself as the precinct captain. His face was stern, his voice commanding. "Stand down," he ordered, looking directly at the officers. "I need a full explanation of what's going on here, and I need it now." The officers hesitated, visibly caught off guard by their captain's unexpected arrival. The crowd murmured in confusion and relief as the captain turned to Marcus, motioning for the rope to be removed. "Untie him," he said firmly. One of the officers reluctantly complied, and Marcus felt the tension in his body begin to ease as the rope finally loosened. As Marcus sat up, gasping for air, the captain knelt beside him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his tone softer now. Marcus shook his head, still processing everything. Before he could answer, Jasmine stepped forward, still recording. "Why was he treated like this?" she asked. "What's the explanation?" The captain stood and turned to his officers, his expression unreadable. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said. But just as the tension seemed to ease, a voice from the crowd shouted, "Check their dashboard cameras. Check the footage." The attorney nodded in agreement, quickly requesting the release of the recordings. What happened next stunned everyone. The dashcam footage revealed something that hadn't been clear before, a split-second moment where one officer seemed to deliberately escalate the situation, tying the rope around Marcus despite him being fully cooperative. The crowd erupted in anger, but the captain raised his hand to silence them. "This will be handled immediately," he promised, his tone resolute. The attorney stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "We'll ensure Marcus gets justice. This isn't over." And as Marcus stood with the help of Harold, he looked around at the faces in the crowd, strangers who had stood by him in his darkest moment. There was still so much to process, but one thing was certain: this night would change everything. As the night settled, the crowd began to disperse, but the impact of what had happened lingered in the air. Marcus, still shaken but determined, thanked Harold, Jasmine, and the attorney for stepping in when he needed it most. The attorney assured him that her organization would handle his case, vowing to hold those responsible accountable. The precinct captain stayed behind, speaking with Marcus and a few witnesses. Though he promised transparency and swift action, Marcus knew this was just the beginning of a long fight. He looked around at the faces of the people who had stood up for him, strangers who refused to let injustice go unnoticed. It gave him hope, even in the midst of his pain. Jasmine's video quickly gained traction online, sparking a wave of support and calls for reform. For Marcus, it was a reminder of the power of community and the courage it takes to stand together in the face of injustice. Though the scars of that night would remain, so would the strength of the voices that refused to stay silent. And in that, there was hope for a better tomorrow.